This story reveals a shocking secret about Joan Baez, the famous folk singer everyone knew for her peaceful protest songs. People always saw her as the symbol of the peace and love movement. She sang about harmony and everyone thought she was gentle and kind. But underneath that sweet image, Joan Baez was keeping a list of 5 music stars she absolutely couldn't stand. These weren't just small disagreements. These were deep wounds that lasted for years. She never talked about them publicly, until much later in her life. These hidden feuds show us a different side of the folk music world that nobody knew about. It turns out that the peace and love generation had plenty of anger and betrayal too. The first person on Joan's list was Bob Dylan, and this one hurt the most. In the early 1960s, Joan and Bob weren't just 2 folk singers working together, they were the heart of a whole movement. They sang together, traveled together, and believed in the same causes. Joan was already famous when she met Bob. He was just starting out, and she helped him become a star. She brought him on stage at her concerts and shared her audience with him. She truly believed in his talent and his message. They were also romantically involved, which made everything more intense. But as Bob Dylan got more famous, he changed completely. The man who used to share everything with her started hiding behind dark sunglasses. He stopped calling her and stopped caring about her feelings. In 1965, he planned a huge tour and didn't invite her to join him. He gave no explanation and no warning, he just cut her out of his life. Then came the famous moment at the Newport Folk Festival, when Dylan played electric guitar instead of acoustic. The folk music fans were shocked, but Joan's real shock was about something else. It was about how coldly he had ended their relationship. He started making fun of the causes she believed in. He acted like their whole past together was just a joke. The young man she had loved turned into someone she didn't recognize. Years later, when reporters asked him about Joan, he would laugh and tell funny stories like their relationship meant nothing. Joan never found it funny. To her, Bob Dylan showed that even rebels could sell out, and even poets could become cold and heartless. The second person who made Joan's list was David Crosby. He was known for his beautiful harmony singing, but he also had a massive ego. He sang like an angel but acted like a devil. Joan first met Crosby in the late 1960s in Laurel Canyon, where many musicians lived. At first she found him interesting. He was smart, outspoken, and never afraid to say what he thought. He seemed bold and exciting, but Joan soon learned that his charm had a very nasty side. Behind his relaxed hippie style and famous mustache was a man who loved to hurt people with his words, especially strong women. The worst moment came at a televised anti-war event in 1970. Joan was backstage, getting ready to sing a protest song about political prisoners. It was an important cause she deeply believed in, but before she went on, Crosby went in front of the cameras. With his usual smirk and a cigarette in his hand, he decided to insult her. He said Joan was more show than substance, basically calling her a fake who only pretended to care about important causes. Millions of people watching on TV heard his cruel words. Joan stayed calm and professional. She went on stage and sang her songs perfectly. But later that night in private she cried, not because she was weak, but because she was so angry. Here was a man who claimed to believe in peace and love, but he had just attacked her in the worst way possible. While Joan had been arrested for her beliefs, while she had gone hungry during protest fasts, while she had put herself in danger for causes, Crosby just sat on safe stages and criticized others. After that night, Joan made sure she was never at the same event as Crosby. She turned down interviews, panels and recording sessions if he would be there. To her, he represented the worst kind of fake activism. The third person wasn't a musician but someone from the protest movement itself. Jerry Rubin was a famous revolutionary in the 1960s. His voice was louder than any electric guitar, and he filled college campuses and protest rallies with his angry speeches. He wasn't subtle or gentle, He was all about revolution, attention, and making headlines. He marched everywhere with his fist raised and his voice shouting. At first Joan admired his energy. He seemed bold and dangerous in an exciting way. He had vision and passion, but she learned that fighting for change comes in different forms, and Rubin's form was soaked in his own ego. The breaking point came in 1969 during a huge anti-war rally in Chicago. Joan was backstage with her guitar, ready to sing to thousands of waiting protesters. This should have been a moment of unity and shared purpose. But Rubin spoke first, and he destroyed that unity. With his usual smirk and cigarette, he started attacking peace-loving singers who, according to him, just sang pretty songs while real revolutionaries shed blood in the streets. Then he got even more specific, saying that folk singers were hiding behind their guitars while real people did the actual fighting. Everyone knew he was talking about Joan. The crowd laughed loudly at his jokes. Joan felt like she had been stabbed in the back. Her fingers froze on her guitar strings. She could barely breathe. This man who she thought was fighting the same fight had just turned her sincere beliefs into a big joke. He had thrown her under the bus just to get applause and attention. Joan still went on stage and sang. She stayed calm and strong, but that night, she made a decision that would last forever. She would never share a stage with Jerry Rubin again. Not because she was afraid, but because she had principles. To Joan, being courageous without being kind wasn't revolution. It was just meanness wearing a clever disguise. The fourth betrayal came from Paul Simon, and this one happened in the recording studio. In 1978, Joan and Paul tried to work together on some music. This should have been an amazing collaboration between two legendary artists. Instead, it turned into a disaster within just a few hours. From the very first moment, Paul acted like he was in complete control. He ran the recording session like a strict, impatient conductor. He kept stopping Joan in the middle of songs. He corrected her singing with sharp, critical comments. The worst part came when he wanted her to change the words in a very personal song she had written after experiencing a loss. This song meant everything to Joan, and Paul wanted to change it like it was nothing. The atmosphere in the studio became incredibly tense. Joan clenched her jaw and tried to stand up for herself. But every idea she suggested was met with a sigh, an eye roll, or a fake polite smile. By the time they got to the third song, it wasn't about music anymore. It had become a silent war. Joan finally had enough. She walked out with her head held high, though her voice was shaking with emotion. Paul didn't try to stop her. He didn't say a single word. For someone like Joan, who had stood up to powerful politicians and sung alongside civil rights leaders, being made to feel small by another artist was shocking. She had never experienced anything like it. Years later, she told a friend that Paul Simon was the one person who made her feel like she wasn't even there. After that studio disaster, they rarely met again. When they did run into each other, Joan made sure it was just in passing. To her, Paul Simon represented a special kind of cold intelligence, the kind that built walls between people instead of bringing them together. The fifth and perhaps most painful name on Joan's list was another woman, Joni Mitchell. This should have been a friendship. Two women with guitars, two icons of folk music, two voices of their generation. They should have been like sisters, supporting each other in a male-dominated industry. But the truth was completely different. Their relationship was ice-cold from the very beginning. Their first meeting backstage in 1968 was a quiet disaster. Joan approached Joni warmly, trying to be friendly. But Joni barely looked up from her drink and gave only a cold nod in response. Things got worse from there. Joni Mitchell once publicly said that Joan's voice sounded too much like church, and that it had no soul. This criticism cut deep. Joan didn't respond publicly, but in her private writings, she described Joni as ice in a silk dress, pretty, but freezing cold. What followed wasn't a dramatic fight, it was something colder and more haunting. Their conflict was like fog slowly creeping across a stage. They silently turned down each other's invitations. They avoided each other's tribute concerts. When cameras were around, they would smile politely, but the moment the photos were taken, they would turn away from each other. This wasn't hot anger, it was like they had decided to completely erase each other from their lives. For fans who loved both artists, this was especially sad. Two women who had shaped a generation, who had so much in common, were kept apart by an unspoken feud. For Joan, Joni became a permanent line she wouldn't cross. She respected Joni's songwriting talent, and even wished she could write songs like that. But she couldn't stand the way Joni seemed to look down on everyone, the way superiority followed her everywhere, like expensive perfume. Their Cold War became legendary, unspoken, unresolved, and painfully real. These 5 names might never appear on any of Joan's song lists, but they shaped the woman behind the folk music legend. Joan Baez was never someone who yelled or made scenes. She never needed to. Her silence spoke louder than 1,000 angry headlines. When she finally decided to talk about these 5 people, the ones who had hurt, betrayed, or humiliated her, it wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about creating drama or selling stories to magazines, it was simply about finally letting go. She wasn't burning bridges dramatically, she was just quietly acknowledging that those bridges had already fallen down long ago. Joan handled these conflicts in her own unique way. There were no press statements, no social media posts, no public arguments. Instead, there was just a quiet shift in her demeanor. She would refuse to sing certain songs that reminded her of these people. She would quietly remove them from her personal story. Some artists fight back with loud music or angry lyrics. Joan Baez fought back with grace. But grace doesn't mean forgetting what happened. And in that quiet strength, in the way she held both her principles and her pain, she remained exactly who she had always been. She stayed unshaken by the betrayals, unbending in her peace. And unmistakably Joan. The queen of folk music had her secret list, but she never let it define her. Instead, she let her music and her dignity speak for themselves. That's the real story behind the peaceful protest singer. A woman strong enough to remember the hurt, but wise enough not to let it destroy her spirit.